The silence of the Miller household was usually a source of peace, but tonight it felt like a stretched wire ready to snap. In the nursery, 6-month-old Leo was fast asleep, his chest rising and falling in a perfect rhythmic slumber. But outside his door, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Buster, the family's usually gentle golden retriever, was pressed against the hallway wall, his hackles raised like jagged glass. A low, vibrating growl hummed in his throat, a sound David had never heard in the 5 years he'd owned the dog. Buster wasn't looking at the door, and he wasn't looking at David. His amber eyes were locked with terrifying intensity on a specific patch of drywall right behind the baby's crib. "Buster, enough, go to your bed," David whispered, his voice thick with sleep deprivation and growing irritation. He reached for the dog's collar, but Buster didn't budge. Instead, the dog bared his teeth, snapping at the air toward the wall, followed by a frantic, desperate whining. David felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. It was 3 a.m. The house was a fixer-upper they had bought 6 months ago, a charming Victorian with a history as thick as its floorboards. He tried to tell himself it was just a mouse, or perhaps a settling beam. But Buster was a dog who slept through thunderstorms and firecrackers. He didn't growl at shadows. Suddenly, Buster began to claw at the wallpaper, his nails rhythmic and frantic, tearing into the floral pattern Emily had spent weeks picking out. David stepped forward to stop him, but as he moved closer to the wall, he stopped dead. He didn't see anything and he didn't hear anything, but he felt it. A faint, irregular vibration against the soles of his bare feet, and a strange, metallic heat radiating from the plaster. That was the moment David realized that his dog wasn't being aggressive. He was terrified. And whatever was causing that terror wasn't in the room. It was inside the house itself, mere inches away from his sleeping son. David and Emily had spent their entire life savings on the house on Willow Creek. It was a sprawling Victorian, full of character, intricate crown moldings, and the kind of good bones David loved to talk about. To them, it was the perfect sanctuary, the place where they would watch their son, Leo, grow up. For the first few months, it felt like a dream come true, a fresh start in a quiet neighborhood. But that dream began to shift subtly shortly after they moved Leo into his own nursery. Buster had always been Leo's shadow. From the second they brought the baby home from the hospital, the golden retriever had appointed himself the boy's silent guardian. He usually slept at the foot of the crib, his tail thumping softly against the floor whenever the baby stirred. But about a week ago, the thumping stopped. Buster began to sit in the far corner of the nursery, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, staring intensely at the north wall. At first, Emily tried to rationalize it. "It's an old building, David. The pipes probably rattle, or maybe there are squirrels in the crawl space," she'd say, trying to soothe her own growing unease. But David noticed that Buster had stopped eating his favorite treats. The dog's focus was singular, almost obsessive. He would stand by that wall for hours, his ears twitching as if he were listening to a frequency human ears simply couldn't catch. The local vet suggested it was just relocation anxiety, but David knew his dog. He saw the way Buster's eyes darted back and forth, tracking something invisible behind the plaster. It wasn't a random stare. It was a hunt. As the days passed, the atmospheric pressure in the nursery seemed to drop. The room felt inexplicably colder, despite the heating being on full blast. By the time that fateful 3 a.m. arrived, the tension had reached a breaking point. David was standing in the dark, clutching a heavy hammer he didn't even remember grabbing, staring at a dog that was now snarling at a wall that, to any sane person, looked perfectly normal. The hammer felt cold and impossibly heavy in David's grip. He stood frozen in the dim glow of the whale-shaped nightlight, his shadow stretched long and distorted across the nursery floor. For a long minute, the only sounds were the soft, whistling breaths of baby Leo and the guttural, rhythmic snarling coming from Buster. "David, what are you doing?" The voice came from the doorway. Emily stood there, wrapped in a thick cardigan, her face pale in the shadows. Her eyes darted from David's hammer to the shredded wallpaper where Buster had been clawing. "It's 3 in the morning. Why do you have a sledgehammer in the baby's room?" "Listen to him, Em," David whispered, his eyes never leaving the wall. "He's not just barking, he's warning us." "He's a dog, David. He probably hears a raccoon or a leaky pipe. You're going to wake the baby and petrify him." She stepped into the room, reaching for Buster's collar. "Come on, boy. Out. Now." But as Emily leaned toward the wall to grab the dog, she stopped. Her hand hovered inches from the floral pattern. Her brow furrowed, and the annoyance on her face was replaced by a look of confusion. "Why is it so hot?" she murmured. She pressed her palm against the drywall. A second later, she recoiled as if she'd touched a stove. "David, this wall, it's vibrating and it's burning." David stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't use the hammer yet. Instead, he pressed his ear against the plaster, right where Buster's nose was glued. At first, there was only the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears. But then, beneath the silence, he heard it. It wasn't a mouse. It wasn't a pipe. It was a low, mechanical drone. A billion tiny clicking sounds layered over a hum so deep it felt like it was coming from the center of the earth. It sounded like a machine made of glass and wings. And with the heat came a smell, faint at first but now unmistakable. The sickly sweet cloying scent of rotting sugar and ozone. "Get Leo," David ordered, his voice cracking. "Now, Emily. Get him out of the room." "David, you're scaring me. What is it?" "I don't know, but look at the wall." As they watched, a tiny, dark liquid began to weep from the seam where the wall met the ceiling. It looked like blood in the dim light, but as it trailed down the wallpaper, it glistened gold. Honey. But it wasn't just honey. The wall began to groan, the old Victorian studs creaking under a weight they were never meant to hold. Buster let out a sharp, panicked yelp and jumped back, his eyes tracking something that seemed to be moving behind the surface of the drywall. The vibration was no longer faint. The entire north side of the room was beginning to thrum like a giant, angry heart. Emily didn't argue further. She scooped Leo out of his crib, the baby finally stirring and beginning to cry as he felt his mother's frantic energy. She ran for the door, Buster following close at her heels, but the dog stopped at the threshold. He looked back at David, letting out one final commanding bark. It was a plea. David looked at the wall, then at the hammer. He knew that by swinging, he might destroy the nursery they had worked so hard to build. But as a section of the plaster began to bulge outward, crackling like eggshells, he realized he didn't have a choice. The first swing of the sledgehammer felt like hitting a drum made of liquid. Instead of a sharp crack, there was a dull, heavy thud, and the head of the hammer sank deep into the drywall. As David pulled the tool back, a jet of thick, amber-colored liquid sprayed out, coating his arms and the nursery floor. It was warm, unnervingly warm, and smelled of wild clover and ancient dust, but the sound that followed was what truly stopped his heart. The low drone he had heard through the plaster exploded into a rhythmic, deafening roar. It was the sound of 1,000 tiny engines starting at once. David swung again, driven by a primal need to see the face of the enemy Buster had been fighting for weeks. This time, a massive chunk of the wall gave way, crashing onto the carpet. David stumbled back, coughing as a cloud of grey dust and a swarm of golden bodies erupted into the room. He shielded his eyes, but through the chaos, he saw it. The entire cavity between the studs wasn't filled with insulation. It was a pulsating architectural nightmare. A massive wild honeycomb, dark as mahogany and dripping with glistening nectar, stretched from the floor to the ceiling. It looked like the internal organs of the house itself. But there was something else. Twined through the wax and the thousands of crawling bees were the house's original 1920s wires. The insulation on the wires had long since rotted away, and the weight of the massive hive, estimated later to be nearly 200 pounds, had crushed the copper together. As the air hit the cavity, David saw a bright blue spark dance across the honey-soaked wood. The metallic heat he had felt wasn't just the bees. It was an electrical fire, smoldering in silence behind the nursery wall. "Buster, get back!" David yelled. But the dog didn't run. Buster stood at the door barking a specific, sharp rhythm, almost as if he were guiding David out. Small flames began to lick at the edges of the exposed wood, fed by the oxygen now pouring through the hole David had made. The honey began to bubble. David realized with a jolt of pure terror that if he hadn't broken that wall tonight, the entire nursery would have been an inferno within the hour, with Leo trapped inside. The good bones of the house were literally burning from the inside out. He grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the rocking chair and threw it over the hole, trying to stifle the oxygen, but the bees were everywhere, a golden cloud of confusion. He backed out of the room, slamming the door shut to contain the swarm and the heat, his lungs burning. He found Emily in the living room, clutching Leo, her face illuminated by the flickering lights of the hallway. "We have to go," David gasped, grabbing her arm. "The house is on fire. Buster, he saved us. He knew the wires were sparking." As they ran toward the front door, David looked down. Buster was leading the way, his tail low but his head held high. He hadn't just sensed a noise. He had sensed the literal death of their home before it even started. The night air was a shock to David's lungs, crisp and cold compared to the suffocating, honey-sweet heat of the nursery. They huddled on the far side of the lawn, Emily clutching Leo so tightly the baby had stopped crying and was simply staring at the house with wide, confused eyes. Buster stood at their feet, his sides heaving, his amber eyes never leaving the second-story window. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens tore through the quiet neighborhood. 3 fire engines screeched to a halt, their red and blue lights painting the Victorian facade in a macabre rhythm. David watched, leaning heavily against a maple tree, as a crew of firefighters in full turnout gear stormed the front door. "The nursery," David shouted, pointing upward. "It's behind the north wall. There's a hive and sparking wires." The next hour was a blur of controlled chaos. David watched through the window as the glow in the nursery intensified, then was met by the powerful spray of a chemical extinguisher. Smoke, thick, grey and smelling of burnt sugar, billowed out into the night sky. When the fire chief, a burly man named Miller with 20 years on the force, finally stepped back out onto the porch, he was wiping soot from his forehead. He walked straight toward David, his expression a mix of exhaustion and genuine disbelief. "You the one who took a hammer to that wall?" the chief asked. David nodded. "My dog wouldn't stop growling at it. I thought he was losing his mind." The chief looked down at Buster, then back at David. "Son, that dog didn't just save your house. He saved your lives. We found a mother hive in there. It wasn't just in the nursery, it had migrated from the attic down through the main electrical spine of the building. Those old wires had been stripped bare by the weight and the acidity of the honey. It was arcing like a Tesla coil." He paused, glancing back at the charred window. "If you hadn't opened that wall when you did, the fire would have stayed oxygen-starved behind the plaster until it got hot enough to flash over. By the time your smoke detectors went off, the entire upper floor would have dropped into the living room. You had maybe 20 minutes of borrowed time left." Emily let out a strangled sob, burying her face in David's shoulder. David reached down and felt Buster's head. The dog was trembling now, the adrenaline finally leaving his system. As the firefighters began to haul their hoses back to the trucks, one of them walked over and knelt beside Buster, offering him a drink from a specialized pet oxygen mask. "I've seen dogs bark at fires before," the firefighter muttered, "but I've never seen one predict an electrical short through 4 inches of lath and plaster. This isn't just a dog. This is a miracle with fur." The restoration of the Willow Creek house took nearly 4 months. The nursery had to be gutted, the ancient wiring replaced with modern fire-resistant circuitry, and the mother hive professionally relocated to a local apiary. But for David and Emily, the house didn't feel like a fixer-upper anymore. It felt like a fortress. They eventually moved Leo back into his room, but the nursery looked different now. On the north wall, where the nightmare had once lived, they didn't put back the floral wallpaper. Instead, they commissioned a local artist to paint a mural. It featured a sprawling golden sun, and in the center of that sun was the silhouette of a golden retriever, standing guard. Buster, now back to his gentle, treat-loving self, doesn't growl at the walls anymore. He spends his afternoons napping in the patch of sunlight right under the mural, his tail thumping softly whenever Leo giggles in his sleep. The story of the Miller family became a legend in the town of Willow Creek. It serves as a reminder that we often share our homes with creatures whose senses are tuned to frequencies we can't even imagine. We think we are the ones taking care of them, providing the food, the shelter, and the affection. But as David looks at the scar on his hand from that night, and then at the dog sleeping peacefully by his son's crib, he knows the truth. Sometimes the good bones of a house aren't the beams or the foundation. Sometimes the good bones are the ones walking on four legs, watching the shadows and listening to the walls, ready to bark when the rest of the world is too deaf to hear the danger.